A Fulani group is asking President Tinubu to call Sunday Igboho to order. Not the herders accused of kidnapping a pregnant woman in Oyo State. Not the men accused of killing her and her ransom courier. Igboho, the man who showed up to demand they be found. That is not a typo. That is Nigeria in real time on the 21st of June, 2026. For weeks, federal officials have hesitated to even use the word terrorist for the armed groups burning down communities from the northwest into the southwest. But the moment a Yoruba self-defense figure threatens to go looking for kidnappers himself, the machinery moves fast. Statements drafted, security agencies invoked, calls for restraint issued within hours. So here is the question nobody in the official statements is asking out loud. In today's Nigeria, who exactly gets called a terrorist and who gets protected from the label? Before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, welcome. Naija Insight Desk exists for one reason, to give you the kind of analysis that goes beyond the headlines and the noise. Subscribe now because this conversation is about to get deeper. Let's establish exactly what happened because the viral clips alone don't give you the full sequence. On the night of Friday, June 19, 2026, gunmen struck Igboho town in the Oorelope local government area of Oyo State, the same hometown that gives Sunday Igboho his popular name Igboho. A woman, her children, and a sibling were abducted. This was not an isolated event. It followed an earlier, more brutal incident in the same town. A pregnant woman had been kidnapped, a ransom of 300 million naira demanded and later reduced to 150 million naira. And according to Igboho's own account, both the woman and the person who delivered the ransom were killed by her captors. By Sunday, June 20, 2026, Igboho was at the palace of the Alepata of Igboho land, Oba Joel Olawu, addressing Fulani community leaders, traditional chiefs and police officers directly. He gave a 2-hour ultimatum for the release of the latest abductees, accused unnamed members of the local Fulani community of harboring or shielding the kidnappers, and warned the divisional police officer against any complicity. He also alleged, without yet naming names, that politicians were playing a game with the country's insecurity and promised to expose who he believes is backing the criminals. The Oyo State Police Command opened an investigation not into the kidnapping syndicate but into the language used in Igboho's video. By Sunday, June 21st, the Oorelope local government chairman Jacob Ogundiran had publicly denied viral claims that the abducted victims had been released, calling the reports false and misleading. That same day, a Fulani socio-cultural body calling itself the Concerned Fulani People of Nigeria issued a statement not condemning the kidnapping but asking President Tinubu and Oyo State Governor Seyi Makinde to caution Igboho over what it called inflammatory remarks. This is not Igboho's first confrontation with Fulani communities in the southwest. In January 2021, he led a forced eviction of Fulani settlers from Ibarapa in Oyo State, an action that made him a folk hero to many Yoruba communities and a rabble-rouser in the eyes of his critics, including reportedly in past commentary from international press. Since his return from self-imposed exile in January 2026, facilitated by the intervention of prominent Yoruba monarchs and a formal removal from the federal wanted list, Igboho has positioned himself differently, not as a separatist agitator, but as the founder of a proposed registered security outfit, the Iru Ekun Security Network, which he says is still awaiting federal approval to formally support the fight against banditry and kidnapping. So, this is not a new pattern. It is a recurring one, wearing a new face and arriving at a moment when Southwest insecurity has already reached a breaking point. In May 2026, 39 school children and 7 teachers were abducted from schools in the Ogbomosho axis of Oyo State. 2 people were killed in the raid, and as at this recording, that case remains unresolved. let's look at who is actually supposed to be handling this and where the institutional gap is. The Nigeria Police Force, under the 1999 Constitution, holds exclusive constitutional authority over law enforcement. No private citizen, no matter how popular, has legal authority to issue ultimatums to a community, conduct forest sweeps, or threaten lethal retaliation. That is not analysis, that is the letter of the law. When Igboho says he will enter households if demands are not met, he is making a threat that, if acted on, would itself be a criminal act, regardless of how just his underlying grievance may be. But here is where it gets institutionally interesting. The Oyo State Police Command's first public action after this incident was not an update on the kidnapping investigation, the rescue of the captives, or the identification of suspects. It was confirmation that they were reviewing Igboho's video for the threats it contained. Compare the speed of that response to the pace of action on the actual abduction, which, by Sunday, local government officials were still describing as unresolved with no confirmed timeline for rescue. This is the structural tension at the heart of the institutional breakdown. Nigeria's security apparatus has, in this case and in many others, demonstrated more institutional speed in responding to a vigilante's threat than to the underlying crime that provoked it. Then there is the question of naming. Federal and state security communications have, across this entire wave of Southwest violence, consistently used the language of bandits, kidnappers, and criminal elements rather than terrorists, even when the conduct meets the definitional bar under Nigeria's Terrorism Prevention and Prohibition Act, which criminalizes acts intended to intimidate a population or coerce a government through violence. Security analysts and commentators, including voices within the security establishment itself, have argued that this terminology gap is not accidental. Labeling matters. It determines which legal frameworks apply, which federal resources are triggered, and how international partners assess the crisis. Meanwhile, the institution actually responding with urgency in this specific episode is the one addressing Igboho's rhetoric, not the Terrorism Act apparatus, not a state of emergency declaration, not a coordinated multi-agency rescue operation for the Igboho town abductees. The ambiguity benefits whoever prefers the underlying conflict to stay defined as a local law and order issue rather than a national security emergency requiring sustained federal commitment. It's also worth noting the layered nature of Fulani as an institutional actor here. The Concerned Fulani People of Nigeria, which issued Sunday's statement, is one of several Fulani-affiliated socio-cultural and advocacy bodies, alongside the larger and more established Miyetti Allah Cattle Breeders Association of Nigeria, or MACBAN, which has previously and separately urged the federal government to apprehend and prosecute Igboho, and which has described his reinstatement and removal from the wanted list as a miscarriage of justice. These are not fringe voices. MACBAN, in particular, has deep institutional reach, tracing its founding to 1979 with the backing of major traditional Islamic authorities. Their public position is consistent. Criminal acts should be prosecuted individually, not used to justify collective threats against an entire ethnic community. That is a legitimate institutional argument. It does not, however, answer the separate and harder institutional question: why the state's enforcement urgency in this episode has tracked Igboho's rhetoric more closely than it has tracked the unresolved abduction in Igboho town. Now, if what you just heard challenges what you thought you knew, drop it in the comments. I want to hear your read on this before we get to the part that reframes everything. Now, let's talk about who actually benefits from how this story unfolds. Start with Igboho himself. His political rehabilitation since January 2026, secured through the intervention of senior Yoruba monarchs and a formal exit from the wanted list, depends on him being seen as a stabilizing force rather than a separatist threat. Every viral ultimatum video does two things simultaneously. It comments his standing as the Southwest's most visible self-defense figure ahead of 2027, and it tests how much latitude the Tinubu administration is willing to extend to him in exchange for his continued political cooperation. Reports from earlier this year claim Igboho claimed the president himself encouraged him to mobilize tens of thousands of supporters for anti-banditry work. a claim the presidency has not directly confirmed or denied on the record. If true, it tells you Igboho's vigilante energy is at the minimum being tolerated as a useful vigilante energy. If false, it tells you Igboho is laundering his own authority through a presidential endorsement he doesn't actually have. Either way, the ambiguity serves him. Now consider Governor Seyi Makinde. Igboho has publicly stated that Makinde knows he has the capacity to help rescue the Igboho town victims but has withheld backing. That is a direct political accusation against a sitting governor made by a man with a large and mobilizable Southwest following less than a year out from a general election cycle. Makinde's silence or measured response carries its own political cost. Appear too aligned with Igboho's vigilante methods, and he risks legitimizing extra-constitutional security action in his own state. Appear too distant, and he risks looking indifferent to Oyo State's worst security crisis in years. Then there is the federal layer. President Tinubu's administration has, since January, treated Igboho's reintegration as a quiet political asset, a Southwest figure neutralized from separatist agitation and redirected towards security collaboration. But a Fulani advocacy group now publicly asking the president to discipline that same figure puts Tinubu in a bind. The presidency's traditional northern political base and influential bodies like MACBAN expect visible protection of Fulani communities from what they characterize as ethnic profiling. The Southwest base that helped rehabilitate Igboho expects the federal government to back local self-defense efforts against unchecked banditry. Tinubu cannot fully satisfy both audiences without alienating one of them, and with 2027 positioning already underway, neither audience is one he can afford to lose. Who loses ground here? Arguably, the concerned Fulani people of Nigeria and similar advocacy bodies face their own credibility tightrope. Their statement is on solid legal and ethical ground when it argues against collective ethnic blame. But timed the way it was, responding to Igboho's ultimatum before any clear public statement specifically condemning the killing of the pregnant woman and her ransom courier, it risks being read by a Southwest audience as defending the silence around the original crime rather than the principle of due process. Whether or not that reading is fair, perception is part of the political cost. And notice who stays conspicuously quiet. The National Assembly has issued no emergency statement on the Igboho town abductions. No senior northern political figure has publicly and specifically condemned the killing of the pregnant woman or her ransom courier by name. Silence in a moment discharged is itself a political signal. It tells affected communities that their crisis has not yet crossed the threshold of national urgency.
Strip away the personalities, and this story is really about three deeper national fractures. First, the federal-state power balance. When a private citizen's security outfit fills a vacuum left by under-resourced state policing, and that citizen enjoys what looks like tacit federal tolerance, you are watching the slow normalization of parallel security structures. Iru Ekun Security Network is not unique. It echoes Amotekun in the southwest and various community vigilante structures across the Middle Belt and Northwest. Each one is a rational local response to a real security gap. Each one also chips away at the state's monopoly on the legitimate use of force, which is the foundation every modern constitutional order rests on. Second, the economic dimension. Southwest Nigeria is the country's industrial and commercial spine. Lagos, Ogun, Oyo carry a disproportionate share of GDP, manufacturing, and foreign investment. Persistent forest-based kidnapping in Oyo's rural belt does not stay contained to Oyo. It raises the risk premium investors attach to the wider Southwest corridor. It disrupts agricultural supply chains, feeding Lagos and Ibadan markets, and it adds quiet pressure on a naira and an investment climate that can't currently absorb new shocks. Third, security implications. If armed groups operating from forest enclaves continue facing slower, lower-intensity state response than a single vigilante's viral threat, that is a signal, intentional or not, about where the path of least resistance lies. Both emboldening non-state criminal actors and emboldening non-state vigilante actors are dangerous outcomes. Right now, Nigeria's institutional response pattern risks doing both at once. And does this deepen ethnic tension? Yes, but not because Yoruba and Fulani communities are inherently at odds. It deepens tension because both communities are watching the same institutions respond unevenly to their respective grievances, and each side reasonably concludes the system favors the other. That is not a Yoruba problem or a Fulani problem. It is a credibility problem for the Nigerian state. For ordinary Nigerians furthest from power, the families in Igboho town still waiting for news of their relatives, the Fulani herders nowhere near a kidnapping operation but increasingly viewed with suspicion, the rural Oyo farmer who has lost income to forest insecurity for years, none of this debate changes their daily exposure to risk. The institutional dysfunction at the center of this story is a luxury problem for everyone except the people actually living inside it. This story does not stay inside Nigeria's borders. Nigeria's classification choices around farmer, herder, and bandit violence have already drawn international scrutiny. Foreign governments and advocacy bodies have in recent months pushed competing narratives, some framing Southwest and Middle Belt violence through a religious persecution lens, others insisting it is fundamentally a resource and criminal economy conflict, not a sectarian one. Every viral Igboho video, stripped of its full context, becomes raw material for both narratives simultaneously. Evidence of vigilante justice filling a security vacuum to some observers and evidence of ethnic militancy to others. For the diaspora in the UK, the US, Canada, and South Africa, this matters because it shapes how Nigeria's security situation gets reported, debated, and ultimately factored into everything from travel advisories to diplomatic pressure to the political conversations diaspora communities have with their host governments about Nigeria policy. It also connects to a broader continental pattern worth naming honestly. Across West Africa, the gap between formal state security capacity and the lived security reality on the ground is widening, and ordinary communities from the Sahel to the Niger Delta to the Southwest forests are increasingly turning to self-organized defense as formal institutions struggle to keep pace. Nigeria is not an outlier in this regional story. It is one of its most consequential chapters. Let's steelman the other side before we challenge it, because the strongest argument against Igboho's approach deserves to be heard in full. The concerned Fulani people of Nigeria's core point is not a frivolous one. Criminal responsibility is individual, not collective. When Igboho's rhetoric implies an entire Fulani community in Igboho town bears responsibility for the actions of identified or unidentified kidnappers, that crosses from legitimate accountability seeking into ethnic profiling, a pattern with a documented and dangerous history in Nigeria where collective blame has repeatedly preceded communal violence. MACBAN and similar bodies have a legitimate institutional interest in protecting law-abiding Fulani families, herders, traders, students who have no connection to banditry and who are themselves frequently victims of reprisal violence, including documented attacks on Fulani travelers in Benue State this same month. This is not a hypothetical concern. It is grounded in real recent harm on both sides of the ethnic line. The most common misconception circulating in the comments and on social media is the binary framing that you must either fully back Igboho's methods or fully dismiss Fulani community concerns, that there is no room to hold both positions at once. That is false. You can simultaneously believe that the killing of a pregnant woman and her ransom courier demands urgent, named, individualized justice, and that threatening an entire community with household-by-household violence is not a legitimate substitute for that justice. Those two positions are not in tension. They are both required for an outcome that is actually just. The nuance being lost in the noise is this: the real institutional failure here is not Igboho versus Fulani Nigeria. It is a state that has allowed both legitimate grievance and legitimate fear to fester long enough that ordinary citizens on both sides feel they have no choice but to either threaten violence or defend against threatened violence, instead of trusting a functioning justice system to do its job. What does this mean specifically for Nigeria's democratic trajectory and its ordinary citizens? It means the test of a credible state is not whether it can react quickly to a viral video, it is whether it can deliver consistent, named, individualized justice regardless of who is filming the threat or who is filing the complaint. So where does this go from here? 3 plausible paths for the key actors. 1. The Oyo State Police Command secures the release of the Igboho Tal victims in the coming days, makes visible arrests, and the immediate flashpoint cools, while the underlying labeling and institutional speed questions go unaddressed and resurface at the next incident. 2. Federal authorities formally caution or move against Igboho, satisfying Fulani advocacy concerns in the short term, but reinforcing the Southwest perception that the state polices vigilante rhetoric more aggressively than it polices the violence provoking it, a move that could damage Tinubu's standing in his own regional base ahead of 2027. 3. The Oorelope security network receives the formal federal approval Igboho has been requesting since May, effectively legitimizing a parallel ethnically aligned security structure, a development that would almost certainly trigger fresh objections from Fulani bodies and from security analysts worried about precedent. Watch for 3 specific signals in the coming weeks: whether the Igboho town victims are confirmed released and by whom, whether the presidency or the DSS issues any formal statement directly addressing Igboho's ultimatum rather than leaving it to state police, and whether the federal government makes any move for or against on Oorelope's registration request. This escalates if another high-casualty incident occurs in the Southwest before any of these threads resolve, particularly one involving children, which would sharply raise public pressure on all sides. It de-escalates if the state demonstrates fast, credible, individualized justice on the original abduction, removing the vacuum that vigilante rhetoric is currently filling. 12 months out, if the current trajectory holds, expect continued normalization of community-level security outfits across multiple Nigerian regions, with federal policy still lagging behind the reality on the ground. 3 years out, the unresolved question of how Nigeria legally and institutionally defines terrorism versus banditry versus vigilante justice will likely still be unresolved, unless a future administration makes the politically costly decision to apply the label consistently regardless of who it implicates. So back to the question we opened with. Has Nigeria quietly legalized terrorism? Not by statute, not on paper, but functionally. When a state's institutions move faster against the vigilante's threatening words than an armed group's actual violence, it sends a message about where real consequence lives and where it doesn't. That gap is not legal terrorism legalization. It is something arguably more corrosive. A credibility vacuum that both criminal actors and self-appointed defenders are rushing to fill, each one convinced the state has left them no other option. This is not a conclusion that lets anyone off the hook. Igboho's threats, if acted on, would themselves be criminal. The original kidnappers and killers deserve named, prosecuted justice, not collective ethnic blame. And the Nigerian state owes every community in this story the one thing none of them currently trusted to deliver: consistency. Push back on this analysis if you disagree. Tell me where the steelman for Igboho's methods is stronger than I've given it credit for, or where the institutional speed argument doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And keep watching what happens to the Igboho town victims in the days ahead, because how that resolves will tell you more about the real state of Nigerian security policy than any official statement will. If this analysis gave you clarity, not agreement, clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is actually happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.